Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, Joel and Antonia. I've been listening to your podcast for the past few weeks and have very much enjoyed it. I'm an ENTP married to an INTJ, and while I won't go too deeply into our relationship here, suffice it to say we're doing very well. Anyway, to my question. We're both very heavy users of our intuitive processes, and we've recently decided to have children. The concern lies in that we'd be totally at a loss if we had sensors. We want to be connected to our children, and while we're sure that can happen regardless of their types, it seems like for all practical intents and purposes, raising sensors would be much more difficult for us. We were curious if there's anything known about how to nudge someone toward preferring intuition. The only thing we can point to is that in each of our upbringings, we were taught to appreciate patterns and pattern recognition almost from birth. We're planning on doing that, like using pattern recognition games with our children, but wanted to ask if there was anything else out there. This, of course, is not to say that we would love our kids any less if they were sensors, but it seems like everything, discipline, engagement, activities and interests, etc., would be much more difficult for us to provide. Also, while my INTJ wife grew up with an intuitive parent, I grew up in a family of sensors and know how alienating it can be to be the odd one out. Please keep up the great work. Yours, Colin.
Thanks, Colin, for the question. As someone who has 3 children myself, 2 of them are intuitive that we're guessing, and 1 is a sensor. I kind of resonate with the question, and hopefully we can give a little insight here. I think it's not even just the intuitive sensor thing that could be a potential hiccup in the experience. What happens if you have a little ESFJ child, a little feeler child, and they're not just a feeler, but in if you look at the cognitive functions, they're leading with a feeling process, meaning their thinking process would be their inferior, their feeling would be their primary, or you have someone who's leading with a sensation process or a sensory process, and their intuition is their inferior. All of these things can be challenges in child rearing. So I think it's even more than just the intuitive sensor split when you're talking parent to child. I think it could also be just a feeler child you guys could have, because that's going to show up different for you as both thinkers, right, in your relationship. The biggest thing I would say in this is we have to remember that just because you're an intuitive and your wife is intuitive doesn't mean that you aren't able to engage in the sensory world. I mean, we have all of these components to our personalities, right? So you guys both have sensing parts of you. And also, you've spent a lifetime, especially you, Colin, right? You grew up in a house full of sensors. Your whole family was sensory. So you are used to talking and engaging in both worlds. You can probably be bilingual, as we call it. You can speak to a sensor's world and meet them where they're at when they need to be met there. And that might not feel fun for you. It might not be pleasurable or juicing to you, but you have that ability. So I guess the short answer is I wouldn't panic. I wouldn't freak out about it because I think you guys would be fine. But let's have a little discussion around this and talk about some of the trends, maybe some of our experience with my son who's a sensor, at least what we're guessing, and some of your observations, Antonia, coming into this. Both of us are intuitive, and our experience in raising children through this experience, and maybe that would give some insight.
Yeah, so we recorded a program called Personality Types in Children and Family, and in that program, I talk about this concept of, as parents, our children are going to be our genetic progeny, and that's a part of how we're able to live on and get a sense of immortality. And at the same time, our egos, which is really the thing that wants to live forever, not just our genes. I mean, our genes are the way that we try to make that happen. It's the thing that motivates us to want to continue living is the genes. And because we so badly wanted to live in general, eventually over time, we evolved this thing called consciousness and ego. And then the ego starts to want to live too. Like the ego's like, ooh, me too. I don't want just my genes to be passed on. I actually want me to be passed on. So our egos, I call it ego hitching a ride with the genes, right? Like we have this child and we want so badly for the child to emulate us. And we want the child to, you can see this in parents that really want their children to replicate all of their experiences growing up, right? They want them to be fashioned in the same way they were fashioned because they want a part of their identity, their personality, their quote unquote ego to get passed on to this child. And so when questions like this come up, which is, I'm an intuitive, and what if I have a sensor kid? And I know that you even said it, the number one question is, are we going to be equipped to be able to raise this child? I'm assuming for its own good, right? Like whatever the child ends up being, if we have a sensory child, will we be able to meet its needs? And I think that that's definitely a positive intent for sure. And I don't want to indicate that you have any ill intent, like your egos are running amok and all you want to do is have children that are exact little clones of you. I don't think that that's the sentiment of the question at all. But that said, there is always a part of us that feels a little sad when our children are very different than us, in part because we would like them to reflect who we are, and we want to think that who we are is going to live on after we die. So I think there's a piece of that. I think there's definitely a piece of that comes into play. And I think that that's definitely a part of like when you're making a decision whether or not to have a child. I think there is either a moment before you have the child or a moment that happens after you have a kid and they just are not like you. Sometimes they're disconcertingly like you. And then that's almost like a little weird too. But there's a moment when you realize how different they are from you and you just go, you know what? My job is to be a steward of their upbringing. My job is not to make little mini me's. So I'm going to give some space to my child. I'm going to make it so that they don't have to be little replicas of me in any way, like either by personality type or by experiences or by their own ethics or what they choose to believe in ultimately, their belief systems or whatever. You just kind of give some space to go, they're their own person. I'm going to let them be their own person. So I just wanted to mention that one piece, maybe not even necessarily for you, Colin, but just because I think this is a phenomenon that comes up for parents a lot in general and is worth mentioning. That said, one of the nice things about being an intuitive is that we are, as Joel mentioned, we are in a world that requires us to be bilingual. The majority of the world is not made for intuitives. It's fashioned to cater to sensors. And so that's one of the reasons why intuitives feel like strangers in a strange land a lot, because the world forces us to be a bit ambidextrous. We speak intuitive language and we speak sensory language. But what I've noticed about sensors is that the only reason why they don't do the same thing for us is because they're not necessarily aware that we exist, right? Like they don't know that we exist because the world is made for them. And so they don't even think about it. It's the same way as like right-handed people not giving a moment's thought during the day for left-handed people. But when you're left-handed, you absolutely have to think about this because you're like picking up right-handed can openers and you're picking up right-handed scissors. Like you have to think about how the world is not designed for you. And I think this is a great metaphor to translate to sensors and intuitives. If you were a right-handed person in a left-handed world, you absolutely would think about left-handed people in the same way that left-handed people think about right-handed people. And I've noticed that sensors that are raised by two intuitive parents are a lot more aware. They aren't as they don't think intuitive people are weird. In fact, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll map to their intuitive parents and they'll seek intuitives out because that's what's comfortable for them. That's what's familiar for them. And so I actually think that when intuitives raise a sensor child, they do the sensor child a favor of introducing them to a world that they might never have been introduced to before. They won't be a person who necessarily discounts intuitive concepts and, thinks that's all like woo-woo or mumbo-jumbo or don't even know what you're talking about. They'll be aware of the differences and they can bring that gift to the world. They can be part of, like for us, we always think of it as a movement, right? We want this movement of people who are more and more aware that there's a percentage of the population doesn't think like everybody else. And these sensor children are a lot more aware of that concept. A lot of the sensors that listen to our podcast or follow our stuff, they oftentimes will say they have intuitive spouses or they have intuitive parents or intuitive children or whatever that open themselves up to this world that they weren't aware of before. And because of that, they're fascinated by it. So I wouldn't necessarily think that just because you're both intuitives that you don't have all the equipment to raise a sensor child. You're going to do perfectly fine as long as you love them, care for them, nurture them, etc. You're going to be fine. And the sensor child isn't going to look at you like like maybe your sensor parents did, because your sensor parents went their entire lives not knowing what an intuitive was, and then all of a sudden they had one show up with a stork, right? Like, quote unquote. Whereas the sensor child is going to be raised in an environment where these kinds of ideas and concepts are a lot more, I mean, it's going to just become part of their experience. It's just going to be part of their world. And we've noticed that with, your son, who's a sensor, Joel, like, he's not weirded out by being surrounded by intuitives. Every once in a while, you can tell that he kind of feels like, why are we doing this again?
A little odd man out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that said, it's not like it's so weird or so out of frame. He's just like, okay, this is the thing that we're doing. And I have a feeling that he's going to be a lot more intuitive friendly than maybe some of his sensor counterparts.
I think with him, so my middle son Sawyer is right now, I know he's 7. Why am I think he is 7 years old right now. And so he's really coming into his own, he's becoming his own person. 7-year-old is kind of when you start really stepping into your own self, right? In a lot of ways. And it's not so much that like the ideas and concepts we talk about or the experiences we have or the interesting things that we'll end up doing as a family weird him out. It's more about for me making sure that I'm making sure his needs get met, because they're not on my radar. They're not on your radar as much. Like, for example, it's for him specifically, and it is partly his personality type and partly just the fact that he's a little kid. But I think that he has a great need. Unlike our other 2 children, well, my other son and our daughter together, he has a need for more tangible stability in his life. Like, he really wants to make sure he's got his room and it's organized and he knows where his stuff is. And he has dominion over his desk and all the things in his drawers. And he gets to know like timelines. He wants to know when we're going to do something, when this is going to happen. He's very focused on the tangible external things. And sometimes that's not on my radar. It's not on my radar to make sure that stuff is handled. And so I'll forget to make sure we're meeting his needs on those ways. And that'll be something I just need to be reminded of. And I'm starting to do a better job at making sure, he'll ask us a question. We'll be on a trip and he'll be like, how long until we get home? And I'll say, I don't know, but like about maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours, somewhere in that range. He's like frustrated by that because I didn't give him an accurate metric. I'm just kind of wildly guessing because it doesn't matter to me when we get home. We're going to get there when we get there. I'm going along. Like, we're going to get there in a couple hours-ish. But he wants to know like an hour and 45 minutes. He wants to know the exact time because he's tracking that. It's important for him to measure external things in his world. So I'm getting better at answering him more directly and giving him more tangible answers when he asks me those things. I'm getting better at trying to see if I can meet his needs for that, the tangible things in his life that he can feel like he owns them, he's in control of them, they make him feel comfortable and safe. And I want to continue doing those things. And obviously, memories are important, photos are important for him, things of this nature that just aren't on my radar sometimes. I want to make sure we're giving that to him, and I'm still learning through the process.
Yeah, and I think that's probably his specific type, not just that he's a sensor.
Correct.
Our suspicion, he's 7. When they're young, it's really hard to come down on a definitive type. Our suspicion is he's an ESTJ. So metrics are super important to him, and stability and predictability and just feeling safe. I remember like when he was much younger, before we knew his type, I'm an ENTP, you're an ENFP. Your oldest son, Gunnar, is probably an ENTP. Piper's like 3, so we have no idea. But she's got a lot of ENP qualities coming out. And that could just be because she's a baby, or a toddler, and she's exploring her world. It's like none of us are really all that concerned with physical safety. Like, none of us really care about that. We don't really think about it. But man, our little ESTJ is very concerned with physical safety. So it's a matter of not going, well, you've been outvoted. We're going to do this thing that makes you feel really uncomfortable. Things like when we go to, we have season passes to a local kids amusement park. And there are certain rides he just simply will not go on. And all of us are going on it. And my knee-jerk reaction is going to be like, come on, let's just go on it. You'll have fun. You'll enjoy it. And sometimes we do push him out of his comfort zone. However, I've noticed that if there's something that he just doesn't want to do because he does not feel good about it, I'll respect that more and more. Like, I'm learning to not just go, come on, we're going to go on it anyway. Like, I'm like, okay, you're not into it. That's okay. You get to decide that. And sometimes we'll push him out of his comfort zone. And of course, it's just context dependent. And is this an opportunity to grow, or is this just something he doesn't want to do and we're making him do? And so I've tried to become a lot more aware and a lot more, providing space for the considerations that he has that I wouldn't have. But I think that really comes down to understanding type in general, and understand, because if he was a little ESTP maybe instead of an ESTJ, physical safety would probably be not on his radar as much. That would not be the thing he'd be concerned about. He'd be concerned about very different things, and he'd still be a sensor. So it's also just being aware of your individual child's burgeoning personality type, whatever that is, right? Whatever that is. We could have a little INFJ that is very concerned about safety, just like the ESTJ is, but it would be for very different reasons, and we'd have to go about it differently. So I think having type on your radar at all, recognizing that your children are going to have different needs than yours, even if you don't understand type theory, that all by itself helps us not do that thing that I was talking about before, which is letting your ego hitch a ride with the genes, or like, you know what you were talking about, which is just being considerate and recognizing that the needs of your children are maybe not going to be on your radar naturally. And so you need to be checking in with them a lot more and learning your individual child. So I think it's actually a great question, and I think it's probably something a lot of intuitive parents wonder about, and I like that you asked it, and also I think you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, and the other things, it's not just about, like I said at the very beginning, it's not just about the sensor-intuitive difference. I am a feeler, and both of my sons are thinkers in the Myers-Briggs system, and we sometimes cross wires. Even my intuitive son, ENTP, Gunnar, who's my oldest, he's 9 right now, sometimes we're not on the same page because I'm leading with a different type of process than he is. I show up to the world differently than he is, and we cross wires sometimes. Obviously, it's not anything catastrophic, but that too can cause difference. So I think that idea of being aware of type in general, because your child is probably going to be different than you in some way. Being aware of type in general, whether it's intuition versus sensing, or thinking versus feeling, or judging versus perceiving. You might be, your wife as an INTJ might be very organized in the house, and now you have another little perceiver child, and you and the perceiver are more freeform maybe, and it's driving your wife crazy because they're just leaving stuff around their room. Or all these things can play into the child rearing years and how children show up and parents show up and how we're interplaying as families together.
Yeah, and by leading with a different style with your son Gunnar, you actually lead with the same process, but you supplement it with a different decision making.
Thank you for bringing accurate part in there. I think
Hey,
Colin and whoever's else listening got the idea, but thank you.
If we're gonna pretend like we're experts, we might as well sound.
Pretend. I think we are experts.
Yeah. No, I wanted for anybody who's learning the system, I didn't want that to necessarily throw them off.
Them. Yeah.
So ENTPs and ENFPs do lead with the same process of extroverted intuition or exploration, but their decision-making or judging process is different. And that's what Joel meant.
Yes. Gunnar uses a decision-making process called accuracy, and I would use a decision-making process we've nicknamed authenticity in the Genius system. And those show up very different when you're making decisions on what to do. But we do see the world in similar ways because we both lead with exploration as our driver in our car. So thank you for the clarification.
You kind of want to hit me, don't you?
No. Not at all. I'll give you a nice big kiss after we get off the air.
Aw, that's nice.
The other piece, I was going to say something. Now I got thrown from it. What was I going to say? Maybe you talk, and I'll think of what I was going to say in a moment here.
In an absolutely, completely unprecedented moment, I actually have completed my thought, and I have nothing left to say.
Wow, it's crazy, dude.
Against all precedents, I actually have nothing more to say on the topic.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully that was somewhat helpful for you, Colin, as far as this goes. And again, when Antonia said you're going to be fine, I agree with that. I think you guys, because you're asking these questions, that's really the first step, is to say we want to have awareness. It really doesn't matter what our child is, what personality type they are. We want to show up as really awesome parents for them. And that's, if parents would just ask that, hey, how do I show up for the best parent for my child? It doesn't matter what type they are or who they are in the world. How do I show up the best for them? That is probably 99% of the journey right there. Just asking the questions and being concerned about this.
Yeah, no question.
So what do you think? Do you have a comment? Do you have a question about this specific topic? You can leave it underneath this PHQ on personalityhacker.com. If you have a question that you'd like us to address on PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community, you can ask those over at personalityhacker.com/questions. There's 2 ways to do it. You can record an audio question. We can edit it into the show, or you can ask a question on the form that's on that page, and we can read it on the air and answer it that way. So you have those 2 different options. That's personalityhacker.com/questions. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodd.
We'll talk to you on the next PHQ questions from the Personality Hacker community.